We left the United States in 1861, at the start of the Civil War. Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant on Sunday, April 9, 1865, and for all practical purposes ended the Civil War. In the first half of the 19th century, during the antebellum era, American architecture was marked by an innocent historicism or revivalism, much like Europe. I wouldn't call it naive, for it was somewhat accurate, but I also wouldn't say it was academically correct. There was a symbolic connection to the styles chosen, be it Greek or Republican Roman for its association with ancient democracy or British aristocratic fashion, or with the Gothic as the British Gothic revival came into fashion through the design of churches. In Europe, we've seen the emergence of nationalism in politics as well as architecture. We saw the British chose Gothic for the new Parliament building to build a truly British building, while the French continued to erect their classical exteriors. Italy became a country in 1859 and will naturally gravitate to Roman buildings, while Germany will become a country in 1871 and ask similar questions. But what about America? In 1865, the U.S. had been a country for 90 years and was looking at the 100th anniversary coming just over the horizon. What did it mean to be an American? Could there be an American style of architecture? Paralleling the theory of evolution, American architects, however, did not just wake up one morning and decide to make a clean break with European tradition, but rather the idea would have to take time to gain adherence and momentum, that is, to evolve. Many mid-19th century American artists who had this ambition found their inspiration in the writings of Ralph Waldo Emerson that have been characterized as the first attempts by an American to escape from the influence of European history and culture. In 1836, Emerson had published an essay, Nature, in which he claimed that Americans were free of the old world's cultural heritage. In August 1837, Emerson delivered an oration that he renamed when it was published later as The American Scholar, that Oliver Wendell Holmes referred to as, quote, our intellectual declaration of independence, unquote. Quote, our day of dependence, our long apprenticeship to the learning of other lands draws to a close. Instead of the sublime and beautiful, he made a direct reference to Englishman Edmund Burke's Philosophic Inquiry of 1757. The near, the low, the common was explored and poeticized. I asked not for the great, the remote, the romantic. What is doing in Italy or Arabia? What is Greek art or Provençal minstrelsy? I embrace the common. I explore and sit at the feet of the familiar, the low. Give me insight into today, and you may have the antique and future worlds. We have listened too long to the courtly muses of Europe. The spirit of the American freeman is already suspected to be timid, imitative, tame. We will walk on our own feet. We will work with our own hands. We will speak with our own minds, unquote. In his writings, similar to those of the English arts and craft movement that we've looked at, he focused on nature and function, consciously rejecting, or at least ignoring precedent in history. Emerson will tell you, look not to the past, but to the present, not to the ideal, but to the particular. Look to the problem for the root of the solution, not to Beaux-Art formalism or European precedents and the old ideas of proportion and beauty. American authors who had preceded Emerson in writing about American subjects using the American vernacular included Benjamin Franklin, Washington Irving, Herman Melville, and James Fenimore Cooper. American authors who followed Emerson's lead included Walt Whitman, who is usually credited with finally having thrown out all antiquated English in favor of writing in plain good old American English in his Leaves of Grass in 1855. Mark Twain also celebrated American subjects. He didn't care about the European past, such as Athena bursting from the head of Zeus. Instead, he wrote about contemporary life along the Mississippi River in his 1876 novel Tom Sawyer. an American novel about American life using American English. There also had been American composers who had been writing uniquely American music, at least as far back as 1847, when Stephen Foster had penned O Susanna. He didn't ape Mozart or Bach, but sought out indigenous melodies and used common American words. And the Hudson River School of Painting, starting around 1820, had marked the first foray into an American school of painting. But what about American architecture? Once again, change is a two-step process. As was the case with British landscape architect John Claudius Loudon's recognition in 1817 of the potential for a new style of architecture, it appears that the profession of landscape architecture, with its requirement to be sensitive to the local environment, was also the point of origin for the American search for a modern style of design. Self-taught American landscape architect Andrew Jackson Downing, regarded by many as the father of American landscape architecture, had introduced the logic for a national style of landscape design with the 1840 publication of his pioneering book, A Treatise on the Theory and Practice of Landscape Gardening, adapted to North America. The influence of Loudon's ideas, as well as those of Pugin's writings, are evident in a pair of very influential architectural pattern books Downing wrote in 1842 and 1850, in which he showcased carpenter Gothic houses and stated that Greek images should be supplanted with those of the picturesque or Gothic because, quote, the expression of great wealth was contrary to the spirit of republican institutions, unquote. He also stressed Pugin's emphasis on the primary importance of function in any design. Quote, in perfect architecture, no principle of utility will be sacrificed to beauty, only elevated and ennobled by it. Unquote. Downing, however, had merely echoed Pugin in advocating for the substitution of the Greek revival with the Gothic revival. The first American to write about the possibilities of a truly American architecture, step 2 in the process of change, was sculptor Horatio Greenough, who had submitted the design that would inspire the erection of the Bunker Hill Monument in 1827. In his essay American Architecture, that was published in the 1843 issue of United States Magazine and Democratic Review, Greenough argued that, quote, the United States was destined to form a new style of architecture. Let us consult nature, and in the assurance that she will disclose a mind richer than was ever dreamed of by the Greeks in art as well as philosophy, the true apostles of correct taste in building. But let us learn principles, not copy shapes. Let us imitate them like men, and not ape them like monkeys. The American builder, by a truly philosophic investigation of ancient art, will learn of the Greeks to be American. Echoing Emerson's ideas, Greenough recommended that American architects adapt their forms to the climate and to evolve ornamentation in harmony with American institutions. Quote, in our political institutions, we have dared to be new. Can we not show that art too has a reason as well as government? Unquote. He reiterated these sentiments in an essay he published in 1851 named Aesthetics at Washington. Quote, the men who have reduced locomotion to its simplest elements in the trotting wagon and the yacht America are nearer to Athens at this moment than they who would bend the Greek temple to every use. I contend for Greek principles, not Greek things. Unquote. As an example, Greenough had cited Yankee simplicity in the design of the schooner America that had just defeated 15 of Britain's best sailing ships in the annual regatta around the Isle of Wight, held that year in conjunction with the 1851 World's Fair. But Greenough's call for an American architecture in 1851 was beyond the comprehension of American architects of his generation, if for no other reason than their view of architecture was dialectically opposed to what he was proposing. So an American architect in the post-war 1860s would have either of these European poles, tradition, such as the Second Empire, or innovation, such as Owen Jones's Osler Glass Showroom, to turn to in his search for inspiration. But in order to understand their individual efforts, for there was not only one way to approach the solution, we also need a better understanding of just who was the American architect during the 1860s. For there were architects who have been born in the United States, or even third or fourth generation Americans. I am not addressing African or Asian Americans at this point simply because they are not in the power structure in 19th century America, who have little, if any, affinity for the home country of their parents. They are not Irish living in the United States, for some have been brought up as Irish Americans cognizant of their heritage, while others have been brought up as Americans with no real awareness of their cultural heritage. So then, what did it mean to be an American from these different backgrounds? And should there be an American style of architecture with such a diversity of backgrounds? There were three categories of architects in the United States at this time. First, immigrants who had been born and trained in Europe, many having attended classes in a university whose work represented a continuum of European practice. This category of architect came from principally three countries: Great Britain with the Gothic Revival, France with the Second Empire, and Germany with the Rundbogenstil or Romanesque, who brought with them the theory in which they had been trained. New York architect Leopold Eidelitz, born in Prague, where he received his professional training before he emigrated in 1843, is such an example. Second, native-born Americans who had no personal exposure or experience with European traditions. At the other end of the cultural spectrum, these architects had not been formally educated in an architecture school, for there are no such institutions in the United States prior to 1868, when William R. Ware initiated the first such program at MIT. But they had learned the profession along the traditional artisanal lines of apprenticing alongside an architect in his office. New Yorker Peter Bonnet White was one such architect. Born in New York City in 1838, White had enrolled in the Bachelor of Arts curriculum at the city's Free Academy, that would become the City College of New York, during the period of construction of the Crystal Palace for the 1853 World's Exhibition, a process that White studied and later credited as having influenced his interest in iron construction. It was at the Free Academy that White had been introduced to the writings of Ruskin. He was also introduced to Owen Jones's ideas as he carefully watched the construction, only 3 blocks away from the school, of All Souls Unitarian Church, designed by Jacob Ray Mould. Mould, a British architect who had worked for Jones for a number of years that had spanned the period between his assisting Jones in taking measurements of the Alhambra and in the initial preparation of the plates for the Grammar of Ornament, had been invited in 1852 by a member of the church's building committee to come to New York and design the church. Mould produced a striking Victorian Gothic building with a severe massing scheme and polychromatic exterior, employing alternating courses of red brick and a pale yellow Caen stone. The church was consecrated in 1855, the same year that White graduated, as well as the same year that Richard Morris Hunt had returned to New York, having completed his education in Paris. White had then traveled to Chicago to briefly work on a project, but due to the recession of 1857, was unable to procure any other work and had been forced to return to New York. He then burst into New York's top tier of architects at the age of 23 in 1861, when he won the competition to design a new building for New York's National Academy of Design, the nation's arbiter of taste in painting, having bested the designs of Hunt, Eidelitz, and Mould. While he revised his design and negotiated his contract, White fell in with a group of like-minded individuals who were Ruskin converts, led by British painter Thomas C. Farrar, who actually had been taught by Ruskin at the Workingmen's College in London before he had immigrated to New York in 1860. Following the first exhibition of British pre-Raphaelite paintings in New York, these individuals, including White, began to associate through a series of meetings that Farrow had organized, and eventually they formed the Association for the Advancement of Truth in Art. While this group modeled itself on the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, it is more accurate to label this group as the American Ruskinians, for it was his ideas and writings, and not those of the PRB, who, truthfully, shared little in terms of theory and nothing architectural among themselves, that formed the intellectual core around which these artists gathered. Meanwhile, White finally signed a contract on April 29, 1863, with the Academy of Design. White had based his final polychrome design on Ruskin's theories, including aping the Doge's Palace in Venice. The building was dedicated 2 years later on April 27, 1865. The third category of American architects were native-born, but who had been educated or employed in Europe. Richard Morris Hunt is the first and best example of this type. Hunt had been the first American to graduate from the Académie des Beaux-Arts and was one of the leading American architectural figures in the immediate post-Civil War period. At the age of 19, in 1846, he had passed the entrance examinations for the Academy, where he entered the atelier of Hector Martin Lefeuille. Hunt's timing could not have been more fortuitous, for he had hitched his wagon to one of the rising stars of the Second Empire. In the year between Louis Napoleon's coup in 1851 and his ascendancy to the imperial throne, he had appointed architect Louis Visconti on July 7, 1852, to be the architect in charge of completing the North Gallery along the south side of the Rue de Rivoli, a project initiated by his uncle that was planned to connect the Louvre with the Tuileries Palace, his uncle's former chief residence, to the Louvre. Fortunately for Lefeuille and his 26-year-old assistant Hunt, Visconti died from a stroke in December 1853, and the emperor assigned Lefeuille to complete the Grand Louvre complex. In April 1854, Lefeuille invited Hunt to join the imperial staff on the Louvre project, in which Hunt was involved not only with supervising the construction of the gallery along the Rue de Rivoli, but was also given the responsibility to design and draw many of the details for the facade of the Pavillon de la Bibliothèque that actually made the physical connection of the gallery with the older Louvre. Hunt formally graduated later that year, and upon his return to the U.S. in September 1855, established his practice in New York and would become famous by designing French chateaus for post-war rich American robber barons that were primarily involved in building the railroad in America, such as the Vanderbilts. Thus, we will see that events in American architecture following the Civil War will begin to echo what was already happening in Europe. American architects will be drawn to styles that resided somewhere between one of these two bookends of mid-19th century architectural theory: the use of Beaux-Arts traditional classical precedents, the best examples being French and represented in the work of Richard Morris Hunt, or the use of Gothic principles and precedents, the best examples being British and represented in the work and writings of Peter B. White. Owen Jones's call for a search for a new, innovative style for the 19th century was simply too complex to undertake at the midpoint of the 19th century, especially in the relative cultural backwaters of the American continent. Its time would eventually come, however, as White would relocate his practice to Chicago following the 1871 fire, with major ramifications on the city's architectural culture and community. In the generation following Hunt and White, there were two figures that addressed the issue of an American architecture head-on, in completely new and different directions: Frank Furness in Philadelphia and Henry Hobson Richardson in Boston. They come from different backgrounds and take their American architecture in completely different directions, but that's okay. The U.S. is not a homogeneous society. The question really will be, should there even be an American architecture for such a diverse society that will eventually include Asian and African backgrounds as well? There is no one right answer to this question. Nonetheless, these two were searching for the architectural equivalent of Twain's Huckleberry Finn. Among the issues they will grapple with are 1. Nationalism, that is, what is unique about the United States, and 2. Individualism. What is unique about me as a designer or a client? Both hit their stride in 1871, as it took a few years after the war for the economy to transition from a wartime basis back to a consumer-oriented one. Furness will be interested in eclectic diversity and complexity in his designs, seemingly having agreed with Pugin's dictate to formally express every space in a building. That is, a building should be a highly active, articulated sculpture. I view Furness as the last of the great mid-19th century American designers, following the British Victorian Gothic revival with its polychromatic color schemes and highly picturesque building silhouettes. Whereas Richardson is going to be the first great American architect of the last third of the 19th century, searching for simpler, more compact massing in his designs, with the ultimate goal of repose, that architectural attribute first identified by Owen Jones as a complete opposite characteristic to the hyperactive forms of Pugin. The generation following Furness is going to try to calm things down, following Richardson's examples. Furness was born in Philadelphia in the first half of the 19th century. It is not unimportant where one is born in antebellum America, for the country was highly regionalized. So where you are born will have some impact on your development as an architect. Philadelphia was known for what? Quakers. Their philosophy won't condone highly ornamented buildings. Philadelphia was also known for its local red brick. His father was a Unitarian minister whose best friend just happened to be Ralph Waldo Emerson, so the family was raised on Emerson's ideas. Furness's older brother was a friend of Richard Morris Hunt, so when Frank was 19, he entered Richard Morris Hunt's new atelier studio in New York City until the Civil War started. So he signed up for the Army and during the war won the Congressional Medal of Honor, still the only architect to have done so. Following the war, he returned to Hunt's office, but soon realized his future was in Philadelphia, where his social network would provide him with clients, so he moved there in 1866. The move proved fortuitous, for by the end of the year the city had resolved to host a World's Fair in 1876 to celebrate the U.S. centennial. Philadelphia immediately started the planning needed to build a World's Fair to celebrate the event in 1876. One of the embellishments planned to improve the city's overall physical appearance was a new city hall. In 1869, local architect John MacArthur, Jr. was named the winner of a competition to design the new building. Excavation began on August 10, 1871, for MacArthur's design, done in the still fashionable Second Empire style. In plan, MacArthur had lined the perimeter of the square site with double-loaded corridors. The remaining unused interior of the site was left open as a courtyard. Having to locate the tower's 22-foot thick walls so as not to impede the overall flow of the main entrance and circulation on the ground floor, MacArthur had pushed the tower back into the courtyard. Therefore, the planned 548-foot tower did not rise from the building's four-story body, but from behind it. As the elevator permitted the construction of taller and taller buildings with more and more floors, the absurdity of continuing to use masonry bearing walls to support taller buildings would finally become self-evident with this project. At the time that MacArthur was designing the building, construction on the Washington Monument had been dormant since 1854, and it was not known at this time if it would ever be completed to its originally planned height of 600 feet or what its final height might attain. The objective in setting the final height of Philadelphia's tower at 548 feet was to make it the tallest structure in the world, planned to overtake the planned final height of the Prussians, then under construction, 500-foot tall twin steeples of the Cologne Cathedral. The final height included a 37-foot tall bronze statue of William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania, by sculptor Alexander Milne Calder, grandfather of the artist who would in the future invent the mobile. The tower proved the sheer folly of building a skyscraper to this height using only load-bearing masonry. as the tower took 23 years to construct, not being completed until 1894, and it still took another 7 years to complete the interior of the building. As you look carefully at the top of the tower, you can see that it was decided to complete the tower in iron from the clock stage to the top. The tower's height was not the only, nor the primary cause for the long period of construction. That was more the result of the city's infamous municipal corruption. Nonetheless, by the time the tower was completed in 1894, 18 years after the fair, the Washington Monument had been completed in 1885 to the final height of 555 feet, only to be surpassed by the Eiffel Tower 4 years later. When finally completed in 1894, Philadelphia City Hall was neither the tallest building in the world, nor was its Second Empire dress even in fashion. The building never truly succeeded in garnering the celebrity for the city that it had been originally planned to achieve. So what should we be looking for in the work of Frank Furness? One way of describing Furness is as an iconoclast, that is, one who attacks or ridicules traditional institutions and ideas. In architecture, we usually term this attitude Mannerist. Furness seems to have approached evolving a unique American architecture through eclecticism, that is, combining elements from different styles to arrive at a new style. He won the competition for this building, the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, in 1871, as another part of Philadelphia's Spruce Up campaign for the 1876 Centennial World's Exhibition. In this building, one finds the mansard roof of the Second Empire combined with the pointed arch of the Gothic Revival. These juxtaposition of details will sometimes be compositionally quite jarring, as he will make little, if any, attempt to resolve or synthesize the formal inconsistencies. He also will use ahistorical details, seemingly following Owen Jones's direction to employ either geometry or abstracted nature rather than historically accurate details. Historians say that he refused to be bound by rules. Why did he have this attitude? His biographers offer a number of speculations. First, the influence of his father's best friend, Emerson, and his philosophy of American art. Second, it was personal. He was not rich, he had fought in the war, had never traveled to Europe. He wasn't impressed by the rich. So he could have been rejecting the gentlemanly airs of those in the upper crust who had bought their way out of the war or dodged the draft by going to Europe, i.e., New York City's aristocracy. For whatever reason, he's going to do his own thing. Looking at this building, it's hyperactive in its massing, elevations, and color scheme. It has the fashionable American 1870s polychromatic scheme of the red brick body with light-colored trim, and then he employed black bricks to create a number of different coursing techniques. Its massing is not a simple cube or platonic shape. It is an assembly of different shapes, with each function being expressed with its own functionally derived volume. The term we typically use for such massing is picturesque. This functional formalism will be reinforced with Furness's use of a variety of windows that will communicate the function behind them. The first detail that jumps out at you as being Mannerist is his placing a column in the middle of the entrance, which he has just spanned with an arch. You never put a column under the middle of an arch, because it's not needed. In fact, it completely destroys the need for an arch, because a beam could span the shorter distance. It mocks the arch. Here is an example of what I consider to be a jarring composition. The way in which he alternates on the exterior these three panels against the red brick field, as if they were pistons in a steam engine. He is a magician with brick patterns. Although Furness was idiosyncratic, that doesn't mean he wasn't influenced by European theories. One writer who was influential was immigrant Leopold Eidlitz, who wrote that architecture should perform acts of muscular and nerve functions, paralleling the organic metaphors of architecture at the time. Furness will often exaggerate his structure to be manly. Also, you will find Furness to be directly influenced by the writings and drawings of Viollet-le-Duc. We saw Viollet had published 2 volumes of his discourses on architecture in 1863 and 1872, so his second volume is hot off the presses when Furness wins the Philadelphia competition. Not different from today, for we all look at what is the latest magazine or book, and in 1871, that was Viollet-le-Duc. Some of Violet's ideas at this moment were: 1. Generate a style based on the location, its climate and available materials, what today we call regionalism. This was opposed to classicism that would put the same classical building in London or Cairo. This also married well with the rise of nationalism throughout the Western world at this time, as well as the contemporary German idea of Zeitgeist, or spirit of the time. Second, the honest use and expression of materials. Third, structural expressionism and structural rationalism, especially in expressing the inherent differences between the tensile strength of iron versus the lithic quality of stone and masonry. In walking through the building, we can find 4 of Violet's favorite details that Furness has expropriated. First, the collar around the column at mid-height. One ascends a stairway to the gallery level. Here, Furness employs exposed metal light stanchions and railings, similar to how Viollet purposefully exposed the iron structures in his designs. He also employs industrialized images for some of his details, expressing the latest technology. Look at the profile of the stairs corner post. We've never seen that shape before. Furness has taken a 3-dimensional shape and cut it with a vertical plane on all 4 sides, generating a unique form. He also used Violet's corbelled brackets that support Violet's dwarf columns. Note how Furness increases the section of the arch from its springer to its keystone. We haven't seen this before either. His interior is a symphony of color. Walls with a diapered pattern in Venetian red, with a ceiling of cerulean blue, accented with silver stars. Here, all of Violet's details are visible. Corbelled brackets supporting dwarf columns with collars at midpoint. Also note the influence of Viollet in Furness's use of exposed metal beams, the iron girder spanning both the opening at the top as well as that in the background. Furness was so idiosyncratic in his buildings, so unusual, that contemporary critics weren't sure how to critique it. They did give it a name, however, Furnesque, that gave them plenty of wiggle room. Nonetheless, his local clients appeared to have found his designs quite successful. Many of them were bankers, and the unique, one-off quality of his buildings were just a ticket for public relations to attract the attention of potential customers. He designs a series of small banks in Philadelphia, some once again in anticipation of the 1876 fair, the first one being the Guarantee Trust of 1875. The image on the right you should immediately date to the 1870s because of its color palette of red brick and light stone trim. Once again, he places a column in the middle of the entrance archway, negating the structural integrity of the main arch, something you would never do if you were following the rules. He incorporates an idiosyncratic shape in the impost blocks for the arches over each window. You've never seen that shape before in history. In a second bank, the Provident Bank of 1876, he uses cut stone on the exterior. While still using some of Violet's details, such as the corbel and the dwarf column, Furness is moving to a more personalized set of details and idiosyncratic massing. In this case, he's inverted the traditional pyramidal composition of weight. Rather than expressing the fact that a building gets heavier as one gets closer to the ground, There is no way around this fact. He projects this hood at the second floor over the sidewalk, using Violet's corbels, making it look top-heavy and awkward. On purpose, I might add. He again invents new shapes of forms, such as the profile of the corbels, by generating a three-dimensional shape and then cutting it with vertical planes, resulting in a non-traditional curve and shapes. The one I am most intrigued by is the curved roof return just below the building's cornice. In the interior, we see more of his truncated ahistorical forms, as well as those that evoke mechanistic images. And also, a la Violet, he has exposed much of the ironwork, playing it off against the masonry in the building. This last bank should blow your mind. The National Bank of 1883. If it wasn't for the use of the same materials, each half could be considered to be a separate building. It's a shotgun marriage. Critics didn't know what to say because it was so different than anything they had ever seen before. The right half is relatively conventional, an arched opening, but if you look carefully, while the underside has a semicircular profile, the upper portion of the voussoirs has a subtle pointed profile. And then you stare at the left side in bewilderment. The joint between the two parts is covered by a turret sitting on a curved pier that just runs into the right half of the building. But the real conscious mistake is the half-arched portal for the building's entry. Never have we seen a deliberate mistake like this before. So the critics are wondering, is this good? Or is it even art? Or is Furness giving us the emperor's new clothes in architecture? On the interior, he repeats the half-arched motif in the back wall, although it is now mirror-imaged, while above these, in the second level, he once again uses the semicircular arch versus pointed arch motif as well. Up in the ceiling, we once again see his homage to Viollet-le-Duc in the exposed iron rod reinforced roof girders. While his forms and unique shapes aren't going to be picked up by any renowned American architect, the one influence that Furness will immediately have on American architects, especially those who come to the 1876 World's Fair and see his work throughout Philadelphia, is going to be his brickwork. He has grown up with the Philadelphia brick tradition and can make it do things that few others can. The way in which he can manipulate a brick to generate any number of unique ornamental patterns is going to be copied by architects throughout the United States. He will have a direct impact not only on the upcoming Chicago school, but also Frank Lloyd Wright. There are two institutional buildings by Furness that you should know. The first is the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Station in Philadelphia, designed in 1886. When I say he sought a highly articulated plan and massing scheme, all you need to do is look at the upper right-hand corner. Compare this to the great train stations you should be familiar with: Union Station in Chicago, Union Station in Washington, D.C., or the old Penn Station in New York. These were a simple rectangular mass into which the various functions of the station were fitted. Furness is 180 degrees opposite. Each major function is articulated with its own massing and own fenestration scheme. These are two fundamentally different approaches to designing a building. One is not inherently better than the other. I'm simply pointing out that Furness will be the last of the Pugin-inspired generation of architects who went out of the way to create highly picturesque massing schemes. Curiously, it has been noted by historians that even as he gave more individual attention to the massing of a particular functional space, when these were combined by Furness, they resulted in such unusual combinations that this technique tended to blur the reading of the building's typology. In other words, looking at a Furness building, you can't quite determine what kind of building it is that you're looking at on the basis of buildings you've seen before. In the lower right corner, we can find where the stairway is from the diagonally placed windows, which, incidentally, show his use of his by then iconic half-arched openings, while the large plate glass windows more than likely show where the public waiting rooms are within the body of the building. As he tried to give more expression to each of a building's specific functions, the resulting unconventional forms made it almost impossible to know what type of building it was. In the station's interior, we find Furness once again using exposed iron for his structure and fixtures, following Violet's dictate to express and exploit iron's tensile quality. In the stair rail, we see his ahistoric ornament using geometric patterns. The main waiting room for Furness is relatively quiet. The fireplace reveals his pencil in the arched fireplace, with once again a semicircular curve on the underside and a pointed profile on its top. Also, he employs his exaggerated angled impost blocks that receive the arch's voussoirs. The women's waiting room is also rather sedate, but he manages to play with the design of the benches, giving the legs non-conventional profiles and the backs of the benches a proto-Art Nouveau curved profile. The second institutional building by Furness I want to introduce you to is the library at the University of Pennsylvania. Designed in 1886, what many historians believe to have been his magnum opus. Right away, its massing is once again a shotgun marriage, in that the stacks at the right are given a very bare-bones, functional form that is just rammed up against the brick main body of the building. Furness designed this space for future expansion by simply extruding the 3 original bays for up to 6 more bays when needed. The guy had guts, as he made no attempt to formally reconcile the obvious formal dissonance. He apparently wanted it. He would say, "Why should I? They serve different functions, but need to be adjacent to one another to be efficient." He covered the stacks with a glass roof and used glass floors as much as possible to avoid the use of gas lighting, the fumes of which would damage high-acid paper. In plan, he set up a cruciform order, with the entry hall intersecting the long main spine of the building at a 90-degree angle, leading directly into the main reading room. The main spine is terminated by the stacks on the right and the radial reference room on the left. As we traverse the building's perimeter, it's obvious that Furness has once again articulated each major space in mass and with its fenestration. Walking around to the rear of the building, we can see how the stacks are just slammed up against the rest of the building. I tried to find an original photo of the rear of the stacks to see what it looked like, but could not, and over time this elevation has been covered with a series of additions that show on this Google image. Take a few moments to study and appreciate this guy's ability to detail. One enters up the exterior stairs, under a pavilion, and into the lobby, where you are greeted by a stair to the upper levels that include a lecture hall and a museum. Once again, he uses over-exaggerated impost blocks that are corbelled to receive the arches over the openings. Furness has detailed the stairway with his iconic images of unconventional shapes and Violet-inspired examples of wrought, cast, and rolled iron as a display of the possibilities of the 3 types of iron. Or one can walk straight into the reading room, a magnificent, well-lighted 4-story space. However, it's now 1886, and the red brick and lightstone color palette is passé. Monochrome is the new architectural fashion we will see in the next lecture. So by this time, American architecture has not only moved to simpler forms, but also to simpler color palettes. Furness seems to have let it all hang out, that is, architecturally speaking. For instance, look at the stacked arcades on the left. The lower arcade he treats as a wall with two arched openings, but at the last moment, he places two of Violet's dwarf columns under the wall to support it and its 4 floors above. In addition, another game he plays is the alternating slipping voussoirs, which curiously refers back to Giulio Romano's Palazzo del Te of 1524, an iconic Italian Mannerist design with its drop triglyphs. Another joke he details in the first floor wall is to extend the radial joints of the voussoirs to fill the entire surface of the wall. In other words, he has not used an arch to span the opening and then placed a normal wall on top of the arch. No, he has built the entire surface of the wall with radial voussoirs. In the second-story arcade, he has cut the tops of the voussoirs in a rectangular form to fit into the coursing of the brick above, that also then imparts an image of an oversized keystone to these 5 centered voussoirs. Opposite the stacks is the reference room, a radial termination of the main spine of the reading room. The reference books are stored in alcoves between each of the columns. I'd like to finish with this art class in the library, as a manifestation of his continued interest in the arts and craft movement, that in conjunction with the wrought iron work in the iron beam's decorative trellis is prescient of the nascent Art Nouveau style. As I stated earlier, you can view Furness as the last of the great American Victorian Gothic designers, following the dictates of Pugin to employ polychrome and highly picturesque massing schemes. He will eventually be the dinosaur among his peers, because around 1880 there will be a major aesthetic shift in American architecture to simple forms and a monochromatic color palette. Furness and his idiosyncratic search for a modern American aesthetic will all but be forgotten by American architectural historians, especially between 1930 and 1965, simply because his hyperactive, unorthodox forms were dialectically opposed to the ideological narrative of that period. He won't be rediscovered until the narrative changes, and that will come with the advent of Post-Modernism in 1966, that will value his qualities of wit and unconventionality.